The morning was quiet, the lake shimmering under the first rays of sunlight, reflecting everything in perfect stillness. I had always loved the serenity here. Owning this stretch of water meant I could escape, relax, and enjoy the peace without interruption. That peace, however, was about to be disrupted in a way I didn't expect, but that I had long anticipated from this particular HOA Karen. I had received an email the day before, thick with entitlement and overreach. She wanted me to pay a community lake usage fee, claiming it was required even for owners. Her tone was smug, condescending, the kind of language that assumed she had authority over someone else's property. I had read it carefully, knowing the HOA bylaws inside and out. There was no clause giving them any right to charge me, because I owned the lake outright. Instead of replying in anger or sending a terse refusal, I decided to handle this the right way. Calm, measured, and well-documented. I wrote a polite but firm response, citing ownership, property deeds, and local statutes. I attached scanned copies of my property deed and water rights. My response was short, direct, and unemotional. It made the facts abundantly clear. The next morning, I arrived at the lake, planning to enjoy a brief kayak session before work. The dock was empty, the water glinting invitingly. I unpacked my gear, secured my life jacket, and pushed off the dock with a satisfying splash. The tranquility was immediate. Just me, the water, and the faint call of birds along the shoreline. Then I noticed a car parked near the entrance to my property, unusually close to the water. A familiar, overly confident woman stepped out, clipboard in hand, sunglasses reflecting the morning sun. HOA Karen. Her posture screamed entitlement, and her expression was the kind of arrogance that had caused countless neighborhood conflicts. I waved politely, keeping my tone calm as I greeted her.
Morning.
Can I help you? She didn't smile. Instead, she presented a list, stating again that I owed the lake usage fee. She insisted that I could not use the lake without paying, implying that she had some sort of enforcement authority. Her words were clipped, sharp, and rehearsed, as if she had delivered them many times before to neighbors who didn't know their rights. I listened patiently, letting her finish. When she paused for a reaction, I smiled politely and said, "You know, I actually own this lake. The property deed and water rights are in my name. There's no obligation to pay you anything to use my property." Her confident expression faltered slightly, but she quickly tried to recover. She waved the clipboard, pointing at the paper as if authority came from the ink on her pages. I remained calm, showing her my deed and reiterating the facts. My voice was steady, measured, entirely unemotional, yet resolute. That's when she escalated, predictably. "I'm calling 911, she said, fingers already on her phone. The audacity was almost impressive. She truly believed she could summon law enforcement to enforce her imagined entitlement over someone else's property. I stayed seated on my kayak, maintaining calm. "Go ahead," I said, still relaxed. "The authorities will see the same deeds and statutes I'm showing you. You'll realize pretty quickly that your claim is invalid." She scowled and stomped toward her car, phone pressed to her ear. I could hear her explaining, probably embellishing the story to make it sound urgent. Meanwhile, the morning air was warm, peaceful, and undisturbed by her theatrics, and the water around my kayak reflected the sunlight beautifully, completely ignoring her attempts at drama. I paddled slowly, keeping my composure, savoring the irony. Here she was, calling the police on the rightful owner of the lake, confident in her imagined authority. The entire situation was absurd, yet it underscored a pattern I had noticed countless times. Entitlement assumes ignorance, and ignorance meets consequences only when confronted calmly and firmly. Neighbors nearby started noticing. Some waved politely, others looked on curiously, sensing the tension. But the moment I remained composed, the scene lost power for her. Authority isn't loud, it's undeniable when backed by facts. By the time the officer arrived, briefly glancing at the scene, HOA Karen was in full panic mode. She had no idea that her call wouldn't result in a fee being paid, a warning, or a confrontation. Instead, She was about to learn that entitlement cannot override ownership, and that arrogance collapses when met with truth, calm, and documentation. The moment the call was placed, I stayed calm, paddling slowly around the lake while keeping an eye on the scene at the shore. HOA Karen's demeanor shifted immediately. What had been confident and assertive moments ago transformed into panic as she realized this wasn't a situation she could dominate with her usual bluster. Her voice rose as she explained to the dispatcher, painting the story as if she were the victim, claiming someone was ignoring HOA rules and that she had the authority to enforce them. Meanwhile, I sat in my kayak, hands steady on the paddle, letting the absurdity of it unfold around me. I had prepared for this, knowing that entitlement often escalates in the face of calm resolve. Neighbors began to gather subtly along the property line, curious but cautious. Some whispered to one another, while others pulled out phones to record from a safe distance. Their presence didn't feel intrusive. Instead, it highlighted the spectacle of someone overestimating their authority. The lake, once a private sanctuary, had become an unintentional stage for accountability. I leaned back slightly, reviewing the property deed and water rights documents on my waterproof case. Every detail was accurate, time-stamped, and backed up digitally. There was no ambiguity, no loopholes, no room for interpretation. HOA Karen, by contrast, relied entirely on assumptions, imagination, and intimidation, an approach that would unravel quickly in the face of facts. The dispatcher's tone remained professional, but it was clear that confusion crept in as HOA Karen rattled off her claims. She insisted the lake fee was mandatory, that she had authorization from the HOA board, and that I was refusing to comply. Every word was a display of entitlement attempting to masquerade as authority. I didn't intervene verbally. I didn't shout or wave my documents. I simply positioned my kayak toward the dock, showing I had full access to the water as the rightful owner. The calm, composed body language contrasted sharply with her frantic energy. Authority isn't declared, it's demonstrated, and every movement I made conveyed ownership without a word. Minutes passed. The dispatcher asked for clarification, and HOA Karen recited the same points repeatedly, growing increasingly frustrated. A few neighbors had edged closer, making subtle gestures that suggested they recognized the absurdity of her claim. It was the first visible crack in her performance. People who had been silent for years were now silently siding with the truth. I noticed that her phone grip tightened as she spoke, her knuckles white. The realization was dawning that the authorities would check documentation, verify ownership, and not simply take her word for it. In her mind, she had assumed compliance was automatic, intimidation sufficient. Reality was different. Finally, a police cruiser arrived, pulling into the small lot adjacent to the lake. The officer stepped out calmly, surveying the scene with an experienced eye. HOA Karen immediately started her speech, insisting on immediate action and reiterating the rules she had conjured. But as soon as the officer asked to see the property deed and verification of ownership, her tone faltered. I handed over my documents, printed copies, and digital backups, every detail clear, legally precise, and irrefutable. The officer reviewed them quietly, nodding as the situation became immediately obvious. Her imagined authority had no legal standing, and her 911 call had accomplished nothing. Her frustration now turned into visible panic. She realized that calling for intervention hadn't granted her any power. It had merely exposed her entitlement and ignorance. The lake remained entirely under my control, the dock open, my access unquestioned. Neighbors, observing from the sidelines, began murmuring quietly, sharing glances that said more than words could. The spectacle had shifted, from her asserting dominance to her being humbled by facts and lawful authority. The dynamic had completely reversed. By the time the officer concluded his brief assessment, HOA Karen had no recourse. She muttered excuses and complaints into her phone, but the facts were clear. The lake belonged to me, her demands were invalid, and the authorities would not intervene on her behalf. I smiled slightly, not out of triumph, but out of satisfaction that calm, methodical preparation had neutralized entitlement without confrontation. Sometimes, the most powerful response is patience, evidence, and the confidence to let reality speak for itself. By mid-morning, the atmosphere around the lake had completely shifted. HOA Karen's initial confidence had eroded into visible frustration. She paced along the shoreline, muttering into her phone, trying to find allies or backup. But the reality was undeniable. The lake was mine, and her calls, threats, and demands held no legal weight. Neighbors who had been quietly watching began to emerge from their homes, drawn by curiosity. Some carried coffee cups, others held smartphones, discreetly recording the encounter. They weren't there to interfere, but their presence made it clear that the spectacle had an audience. Entitlement thrives in silence, but when the community watches, it falters. I remained in my kayak, calm and steady, gliding across the water. The gentle lapping of the waves against the hull contrasted sharply with the tension on the shore. Each stroke reinforced the reality that I had complete control over my property. Ownership isn't about confrontation, it's about authority supported by facts. HOA Karen's son appeared beside her, arms crossed, face tight with indignation. He was clearly expecting me to panic or comply, to pay a fee he had no right to collect. Instead, my relaxed demeanor only intensified his discomfort. He shifted from foot to foot, unsure of how to proceed. In his mind, the lake had been a playground for privilege. Reality was rewriting that narrative. The officer on the scene remained nearby, observing without intervention. Their mere presence reinforced the boundaries of legality. HOA Karen attempted to assert herself, gesturing at the dock and insisting that rules applied to everyone, as if invoking the term could magically give her authority. I simply smiled politely, holding up my deed, letting the documents speak louder than words. As the tension escalated, I paddled closer to the dock and paused. From this vantage point, the scene was clear. Entitlement versus law, assumption versus ownership. HOA Karen gestured wildly, flustered now, realizing that her attempts to intimidate were ineffective. The son tried to interject, but his words were drowned out by the murmurs of neighbors who were quietly aligning with truth and fairness. At one point, she dramatically waved her phone, threatening further escalation. I didn't flinch. Instead, I reached into a waterproof pouch and displayed a fully detailed property map showing boundaries, easements, and legal water rights. Every line and label reinforced that my ownership was not just nominal, it was documented, enforceable, and undeniable. Her son finally let out a frustrated sigh, muttering something under his breath. HOA Karen's face reddened, the mask of control slipping entirely. Neighbors exchanged subtle glances. It was almost as if the spectacle had become a public lesson in entitlement and accountability. The officer, now engaged, approached briefly to clarify my ownership and the legality of the situation. HOA Karen attempted one last appeal, pleading for intervention, citing bylaws she had misunderstood. The officer responded with professionalism, explaining that municipal laws and property deeds took precedence. Her argument collapsed immediately. Finally, she stormed back to her car, muttering and trying to salvage dignity. Her son followed, scowling, now painfully aware that entitlement had no power without legal backing. The tension in the air shifted from confrontation to reluctant acceptance. I paddled back toward the dock, feeling a sense of calm satisfaction. The lake, which had briefly become a battleground of arrogance and imagined authority, returned to its rightful order. Neighbors continued to watch quietly, some nodding in acknowledgement, others simply smiling at the resolution. By noon, HOA Karen and her son had left entirely, no longer attempting to assert control. The lake remained open, serene, and under my ownership, a reminder that facts, preparation, and calm resolve are far more effective than shouting or assumed authority. The incident would ripple through the neighborhood in quiet ways. People would remember it, not as a confrontation, but as a lesson. Entitlement has limits, and true authority is backed by facts, patience, and lawful ownership. The days after the lake incident brought an unexpected calm to the neighborhood, but beneath the surface, subtle shifts were taking place. What had started as a confrontation over a single lake fee had rippled outward, changing the dynamics of the community in ways that were both quiet and profound. HOA Karen, once a dominant presence around the lake and community spaces, now moved cautiously. Her usual confidence had been replaced by a careful, measured demeanor. She no longer strutted around with a clipboard, demanding compliance or trying to assert imaginary authority. Even her son, who had been the epitome of entitlement during the confrontation, had become subdued, avoiding the lake entirely for days. I noticed these changes during my routine morning visits to the water. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now smiled politely. Some even waved. The subtle acknowledgement was refreshing, a quiet validation that accountability had an impact beyond just the immediate incident. People began speaking in hushed tones about the events, sharing their own stories of HOA overreach and entitlement. It became clear that this single act of standing firm had inspired others to recognize the imbalance that had existed for years. The HOA management company, sensing that the situation had escalated into something they could no longer ignore, called a community meeting. Attendance was unusually high for such meetings, with residents who normally stayed silent now taking seats at the back of the room, eager to witness and participate. The atmosphere was tense but expectant. People had questions, and they were ready to hold the HOA accountable. During the meeting, the HOA representatives carefully avoided confrontation, instead using cautious language like oversight and policy clarification. But the residents were not there for euphemisms. They asked pointed questions about enforcement authority, property rights, and rules for communal spaces like the lake. When the incident with the lake fee and 911 call was brought up, the room fell silent for a moment, the weight of the events sinking in for everyone present. HOA Karen sat in the front row, arms crossed, her usual bravado noticeably diminished. She no longer attempted to dominate the discussion, interrupted no one, and responded minimally when addressed. Her son, seated beside her, avoided making eye contact with anyone. The power that once felt absolute in their hands had evaporated under the scrutiny of neighbors and formal authority alike. The meeting concluded with tangible changes to HOA procedures. Policies were revised to include clear limitations on enforcement authority, ensuring that personal vendettas or misunderstandings could no longer dictate community rules. External oversight was implemented for disputes involving property rights, accessibility, or shared resources like the lake. It wasn't flashy or dramatic, but it was decisive, a structural shift that would prevent similar incidents in the future. In the following days, I noticed small but meaningful changes in everyday life. Access to the lake was never questioned again. Requests and complaints were handled professionally and consistently, without intimidation or selective enforcement. Even casual interactions with neighbors had changed. There was a sense of fairness, transparency, and mutual respect that hadn't existed before. HOA Karen and her son eventually resumed normal routines, but their presence was no longer commanding or threatening. They blended into the background, aware that the balance of power had shifted permanently. Neighbors no longer tolerated selective enforcement or entitlement. The incident had created a ripple effect, strengthening community awareness and solidarity. Most importantly, the lake itself returned to being a place of peace and enjoyment. No threats, no unjust fees, no dramatic confrontations, just calm waters, the quiet rustle of the wind through the trees, and the gentle lapping of waves against the dock. The property was once again respected, and the lesson had been delivered. Authority must be grounded in fact, law, and fairness, not assumptions or arrogance. This subtle transformation in the neighborhood was a reminder that one calm, firm stand against entitlement can resonate far beyond the immediate conflict, inspiring change, accountability, and lasting respect. Weeks passed since the confrontation at the lake, and life gradually returned to its usual rhythm, but the neighborhood itself felt subtly different. The tension that had long simmered under the surface, fed by entitlement, selective enforcement, and fear of retaliation, had dissipated. A quiet sense of fairness had taken root, one that didn't rely on confrontation but on the certainty that rules applied to everyone equally. HOA Karen, once the self-appointed arbiter of authority, moved cautiously now. Her loud demands and dramatic gestures had vanished, replaced by careful, calculated behavior. Her son mirrored her change, no longer attempting to assert dominance or flaunt privilege. Even when they passed by the lake or the communal areas, there was a visible awareness that the neighborhood now recognized limits. The imbalance of power had shifted, leaving them exposed to accountability in ways they had never experienced before. Neighbors, too, began to change their own habits. People who had previously avoided conflict now spoke up when minor issues arose. Conversations about property rights, shared spaces, and community responsibilities became more common. There was a newfound sense of solidarity, a shared understanding that entitlement would not go unchallenged. The ripple effect of the lake incident had transformed the social dynamic quietly but permanently. I continued to visit the lake, my sanctuary unchanged, serene, and calm. Every visit reminded me of the importance of standing firm and documenting every step of the process. Ownership isn't just about deeds and paperwork. It's about being prepared, measured, and composed when others test your boundaries. The lake remained mine, free of interference, a place where entitlement could no longer impose itself on reality. HOA management procedures had also improved. Policies were now clearly communicated to residents, with transparent guidelines for fees, access, and enforcement. Misunderstandings that once led to aggressive confrontations were now addressed professionally and consistently. The changes were subtle but impactful. They ensured that the rules served the community fairly rather than empowering a single individual to dominate. One afternoon, a new resident asked about lake usage, unsure of the regulations. A neighbor explained the rules patiently, citing the formal procedures that had been implemented after the incident. There was no fear, no intimidation, only clarity and respect for property rights. That moment struck me as significant. It was proof that accountability and fairness had taken root, extending beyond my own actions to influence the wider community. HOA Karen never issued a personal apology, and that wasn't necessary. What mattered was the restraint and structure that had been restored. Authority had shifted from arbitrary power to lawful enforcement. The community learned that entitlement could be challenged and that calm, informed action was more powerful than anger or confrontation. Occasionally, I would see the Karen family around the neighborhood, keeping to themselves. Her son had matured in subtle ways, more cautious, more aware that crossing boundaries had consequences. The dynamic of intimidation had vanished, replaced by a quiet recognition that fairness and law ultimately prevail over ego and assumption. The lake itself remained a constant, a physical reminder that patience, preparation, and measured action can overcome entitlement. Each ripple on the water seemed to echo the lessons learned, that ownership carries responsibility, that rights must be respected, and that arrogance has limits. Standing by the dock one evening, watching the sun reflect off the surface of the water, I felt a sense of satisfaction, not from conflict, but from resolution. The lake, my property, and the neighborhood had all been recalibrated. Respect, fairness, and accountability now guided interactions in ways that fear and entitlement once did. In the end, the incident became more than a dispute over a lake fee. It became a lesson in asserting rights, standing firm with evidence, and allowing truth and law to speak louder than intimidation. The neighborhood had changed quietly but permanently. And as I left the lake that evening, paddling across the still water, I realized that calm, determined action had created a legacy far more lasting than anger or confrontation ever could. The lake remained mine, serene, protected, and respected, a symbol of fairness restored, entitlement challenged, and balance achieved.